At Carafem, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states, some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form, and if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, Carafem will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carafem.org.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Get your mother-loving ears on because your big-time radio DJ's got news. PayPal lets you choose how you want to pay for all the stuff. With PayPal, I can pay in-store, pay online, or pay over time. What's that? You want this translated into song? I hope you're sitting down. You can pay your own way. You keep those ears on, you hear? Don't just pay, baby. PayPal.
Learn more at paypal.com.
I don't think Richard is that sort of planner. I think Richard tends to react rather than be proactive. From the moment he arrests Rivers, essentially for me, it's a slippery slope that will ultimately lead to the end of the princes. I can't see how you can arrest Rivers, who is, remember, the person in the nobility that the young Edward V knows best and has relied on for years. Now he's just been arrested by your Uncle Richard. That is not going to be something that's going to be swept over very easily, I wouldn't have thought.
Hello. In August of 1483, a sighting was reported of two young boys playing in the grounds of the Tower of London. Rumours spread that these were the two princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. But it was the last time they were seen again, and ever since, speculation has been rife that their uncle, Richard III, had had them killed. Or, and this is perhaps less likely, they had managed to escape abroad. So began the reign of Richard III, as Derek Birks, author of The Guide to the Wars of the Roses, and David Pilling, author of Kingbreaker, join me to discuss this enduring mystery of what happened to the princes. Coming up, it's the final episode of our 6-part epic as we head to Leicestershire and the Battle of Bosworth Field. Please do share with friends and family, and if you can give a kind rating, I'd be most grateful. But until then, it's me talking with Derek and David on The Princes in the Tower. Derek, David, welcome back to the podcast for this final part of our epic series on the Wars of the Roses. And this is terribly exciting. Well, actually, what we're going to talk about is the period since our last episode ended with the Battle of Tewkesbury, which was in 1471. Edward IV wins. So Edward IV can now reign for the rest of his life. So there's this period of 12 years between Edward and then there's a bit of, well, we know who comes after Edward IV. That's Edward V.
Edward V,
yes.
Indeed. And then another monarch who is just got such a reputation, so it'd be fun to talk about. But Derek, if I could turn to you to just talk about Edward's reign. I don't think we need to spend a huge amount of time here, do we? The 12 years till 1483. But what really happens? Does he sort of solidify the Yorkist hold on the crown?
Yeah, I mean, to cut a fairly long story short, really, the 1470s is about consolidation. It's about Edward finally managing to bring some sort of stability, because his supporters, particularly the merchant community, what they wanted was peace and stability. The last thing they wanted was people fighting. Um, so, yes, he does that. It's worth just mentioning that the first half of the 1470s is characterized by this fraternal struggle between the Dukes of Clarence and Gloucester, Edward's two brothers, um, because that will sort of come out in the wash later on in 1483. But this struggle is about the Warwick legacy. The Earl of Warwick, as we've said probably before, owned more land really than anybody else. It is a massive legacy. So when he died, and a traitor obviously, uh, and his brother John Neville died at the same battle, again as a traitor, there is this huge Neville inheritance. And George, Duke of Clarence, was married to the elder daughter of Warwick, Isabel Neville. So, as far as George was concerned, he'd come back into the Yorkist fold. He'd promised to be a good boy and so on. And so he expected that he was going to get certainly the lion's share of that inheritance. But of course, there were two daughters, the other one being Anne Neville, who'd been briefly married to the Lancastrian prince. But she was now available, as it were. And heiresses being available was an important point in the 15th century. And it's difficult if you, I'll précis this a bit. Basically, from her point of view, if she wanted to contest that inheritance, in other words, in theory, in the Middle Ages, if there were no sons and two daughters, it would be shared equally between them. There's no sort of the older one gets more. So essentially, Anne Neville has equal claims to that that Warwick legacy, but she has no husband to protect her and look after her interests. So, from her point of view, who on earth in England is going to be powerful enough to even want to contest it with the Duke of Clarence? Well, there's really only one candidate for that who's eligible, and that's his brother Richard. So Richard of Gloucester, from his point of view, well, there's this huge Neville inheritance. So I want a bit of that. I don't want my brother George getting all of it. So it's a kind of logical step for Richard of Gloucester to try and marry Anne, and for Anne to accept Richard as her husband because it's going to work in her favour probably. So you have this ongoing struggle between the two brothers, which is a big headache for Edward. But the long and short of it is, in the end, the legacy is split, and to all intents and purposes, Clarence gets the southern half of the lands, and Gloucester gets the northern half. I mean, that's a brushstroke which is fairly broad, but that's basically what happens. Clarence, of course, isn't satisfied, because if you'd given him all of it bar one piece of land, he wouldn't have been satisfied, because that is Clarence. So Clarence remains a problem in the 1470s for his brothers.
There's a lot of that where they're never satisfied with these. They're all pretty wealthy, aren't they? But one thing that does occur briefly, is it worth us discussing I've got a dwindling number of French listeners. Is it worth us discussing Edward IV's invasion of France, or is it not really? I mean, he gets some money out of it, doesn't he?
Yeah, it doesn't last very long.
No, okay.
No,
Right, well,
I quite like his French expedition, because he marches about, gets some money, goes home, which, it's probably just about the most sensible thing the English can do in France at this point.
Yeah,
they've got apart from Calais, they haven't got anything. They've lost Aquitaine, which was I think the thing that really scuppered Henry VI. The Plantagenets had held on to that ever since the start. And I don't think there's much realistically they could do in France except, broker a favourable treaty. And then about 20 years later, I think Henry VII deliberately copied what Edward IV does in France. He goes over there, extracts some money, marches about a bit, comes home.
Best way of doing it. Right, okay, yeah. So in 1483, Edward Edward's health is failing, and unfortunately, his eldest son, Edward, is not mature. He's a 12-year-old. So,
Edward's health wasn't failing really.
but he
It
appoints
was
Richard as his sort of to look after Edward, doesn't he?
No, he doesn't. No,
Oh,
he doesn't.
okay.
No,
I
no.
no.
The man who is called the governor of the Prince of Wales, with in the Prince of Wales's own household in Ludlow, is Lord Rivers, who is a Woodville, if you like. I don't like to keep saying a Woodville as if they're part of a political party, but yes, he was the one charged with looking after the prince, with bringing him up, basically. Um, and in my view, he did a very good job of that. And Edward, the big thing about 1483 is that nobody expected Edward to die. So his health wasn't failing. I'm sure he was, suffering the ills of getting older, but he wasn't particularly old. And the whole point about 1483 and what happens is really that nobody expected him to die when he did. And therefore, nobody had all their ducks in a row. Nobody was plotting this or plotting that because they didn't know he was going to die. So, it's just how it was. And I think Charles Ross, the historian of Edward IV, says Edward went fishing, caught a cold, and died, which sort of sums it up, really.
So he does die 9th of April.
Yeah.
Okay, I got that right. That's good. So he obviously has a successor, but the successor's 12. Is it therefore inevitable that George and Richard are going to...
George is dead
Okay.
by this
Yeah.
point.
Okay. Yeah. We need to maybe
Yes, we
fill in
haven't
that
mentioned that.
particular hole
In
with
the
clerics.
barrel of Malmsey wine, of course.
Yes.
Mm.
He pushed his luck with Edward once too many times, and Edward just had enough. I mean, it was a constant carping nuisance, really. He was never satisfied. He always believed there was a conspiracy against him, that everybody was doing him down. And in the end, Edward said, "Right, enough's enough," and he condemned him in Parliament with an act of attainder, which means that you can just say somebody's a traitor and say they have to go. You don't have to give any real justification for it, really.
As I understand it, Derek, Clarence, whether or not he was drowned in a butt of wine, he was but he was privately executed rather
Yes.
than publicly, which off the top of my head, I can't think of any precedents for that. To kill someone of that status and of closeness, he was the brother of the king in England, to sort of kill them in like a private execution seems quite a strange step.
It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
Yeah, I think particularly someone who was attainted, so it's kind of a public show, but then it's a private execution. But I think if you're Edward, you want the least, I mean, Edward throughout his life wanted the least hassle about anything, really. So he had this problem he had to deal with. It was distasteful. He didn't want to do it. It is his brother, after all, who he did owe a little bit. And he didn't. I don't think he wanted to make a big public spectacle of it. That was the last thing he wanted.
Well, that's the first of two. There'll be another two executions that come along the line that are private, that involve
Yeah, there's
that
several
family.
more. Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So Elizabeth Woodville, she has control of her son, doesn't she? And
No,
oh, bloody hell.
no. Her brother, Anthony Woodville, Lord
Okay.
Rivers.
Hmm.
Edward, the young Prince Edward is in Ludlow, and he's there for almost all the time of his upbringing. He's wheeled out for state occasions and so on, but he's basically there. So when Edward IV dies, that's where Edward V, that's where the young Edward V is, that's where or Rivers is, and so on. Now, the point I made earlier about nobody expecting Edward to die, it's a bit like when there's a sudden train strike, and the following day, all the rolling stock is in the wrong place. So in 1483, everybody's really in the wrong place to plot or try and take over power, because it's not set up for that. It's kind of accidental. Richard is in the north. He's not expecting his brother to die any minute and then plotting to rush down and grab the throne. So there's a lot of there's so much nonsense talked about 1483. I wouldn't know where to start. But on this point, it's a shock to everybody, and basically they've got to scramble to catch up, and work out what they're going to do.
But you'd want to get Edward V to London to crown him, wouldn't you?
Yeah. They had a council meeting, and obviously Elizabeth Woodville was prominent in that, partly because her brother wasn't there anyway; he was in Ludlow, partly because Richard was in the north. So there were people like Lord Hastings was there, and the Marquis of Dorset, who was Elizabeth Woodville's son from her previous marriage. And so there was a council, and they decided that, after a lot of discussion, that Rivers would bring Edward to London with an escort of no more than 2,000 men. And, they set a coronation date for, I think, May the 4th, early May, anyway. Now, everyone seems to think that there's a Woodville plot going on, but I think the only one who actually thought that was Lord Hastings, and even he decided he'd got it wrong later on. The evidence for me is very thin. As far as I can see, if you're Anthony Woodville and there's a Woodville plot and you want to get Edward V crowned as quickly as possible, you're going to be racing to London, aren't you? I would have thought. He's not racing anywhere. He's just ambling along, not taking all his time, not rushing, as if he hasn't a care in the world. And that's not, for me, the actions of somebody desperate to seize power. He just sort of works everything out, gets the logistics right, and eventually they set off for London.
But after all we've seen from the Wars of the Roses, isn't this a level of complacency on behalf of the Woodvilles?
I don't think it is, because again, I keep factoring in all the time that they're sort of planning on the hoof. They're not. This is not planned. So new situation, everybody. Edward's dead. What do we do now? And it's the same for all of them. Elizabeth, Richard, Anthony Woodville, and so on. It's the same for everybody. New game. What do we do? How do we start?
Okay, so Richard's up north. What does he do?
Well, he gets a letter from Lord Hastings, who is one of Edward IV's oldest and most loyal friends, and also a power in the Midlands. And Hastings is panicking. This is a letter of panic saying, get down here as quick as you can, otherwise the Queen and her son and brothers and so on, they're going to take over. They're going to control. He's not saying they're going to take over the country. What he's worried about is that they're going to control the council. And when you've got a 12-year-old ruler, the council are effectively the decision makers. Now, where does all this come from? Why has Hastings got this all uptight in his head about it? Well, Hastings and Dorset, the Queen's elder son, by a different marriage. They are undoubtedly the two people in England who have a feud going on. There is absolutely no, they are rivals for everything. Don't get me started on Dorset, but basically, Hastings is worried more about Dorset than anybody else. And Hastings is not the Queen's favourite person. He was sort of, one of Edward's sort of whoring buddies. So he was not exactly the greatest friend of Edward's wife, but there's a lot of nonsense talked about, oh, so and so didn't get on with so and so. And this happened in every reign, basically. So Hastings sends this letter, says to Richard, hurry up and get down here because you need to be taking control. But if you think about it, it's fair enough anyway. He's the king's brother. You'd expect him, everybody expected him to be in a very prominent role. So it's not exactly a big surprise that Hastings saying, get down here. So up until this point, nothing odd has happened, really.
So is this letter then, David, does this mean that this suggests, there are some historians who suggest that this means that, Richard was always intending to come down and cause trouble?
Well,
whereas really, as Derek's just illustrated, it's a perfectly natural way of administering this kind of situation.
I found it very difficult to try and untangle this particular phase because there's so much muddying of the waters. One version of why justifying Richard's actions came out, I think, from his first and only Parliament. He sort of explained why he'd done what he had done and gave his own version of events. And he, as far as I can see, is the originator of this idea that the Woodvilles were cooking up some sort of plot. I think if you look at what he does to not just Rivers, but people who he arrests at Stony Stratford, Gray, I think it is, and Vaughan, and someone else whose name escapes me, they're all judicially murdered. They are killed in this kind of treason trial way, which is kind of the medieval equivalent of a Soviet state trial, where you're put in front of a court. There's no question that you'll be found guilty. It's just a show of justice. It's something Edward IV had done quite a lot. And Richard, his first entry into public life when he was 16, he presided over a treason trial and condemned 2 men to death. That's his political apprenticeship, that's his background. And he's quite capable of this sort of thing. Why is it necessary to kill these men if Richard's got no ambition? And he cooks up, well, he and Buckingham, I suppose, cook up this story of, oh, well, the Woodvilles were plotting. But as Derek said, when you look back in context on the movements of everyone, if they were plotting, then they were very incompetent plotters.
Now, there's a meeting, isn't there, where Richard takes custody of the young Edward. I say a meeting. He takes.
Yeah, there are kind of those are two separate things in a way, and I think it's worth separating them, because here's Rivers with his 2,000 men or whatever heading to London with Richard Grey, who's the other son of Elizabeth Woodville from the previous marriage, and as you said, Thomas Vaughan and others of these are members of the prince's household, or now, of course, the king's household. So he's heading towards London, and he is invited to stop over with and have a sort of convivial chat with Richard of Gloucester and the Duke of Buckingham on the way. And this is something that people have argued about for, well, centuries. Why did he do that? Why did he go there with hardly any men? And I'll tell you the reason. That's because he had absolutely no thought at all that Richard meant him any harm. He and Richard actually cooperated with each other on frequent occasions. If you read some things, they'll tell you they were enemies. Absolute rubbish. They weren't. They got on very well. I mean, even a few months before this all blew up, Rivers had consulted Gloucester about a matter that he was involved in and asked him to make a decision on it. Now, you don't ask somebody you don't trust to put you in trouble, as it were. So there's absolutely no reason for him to doubt that Richard just wanted to get together and sort of chew over how they were going to proceed. It was pretty logical, really. Here was Rivers, the sort of guardian of the king, young king, and here was Richard, the late king's brother, likely to be prominent. What was more sensible than that they should actually meet and have a chat about how things were going to go? And obviously that chat apparently was convivial, we are told. But then the following morning, Rivers and so on were arrested. And that's where the conundrum comes in. What changed, if anything?
So what, Richard slept on it and thought,
One of the things that's frequently overlooked in all of this is a certain person called Edward V, who, if you accept the Victorian painting of him, is a kind of pathetic milksop, who is the pawn of everybody and totally overrun by all these adults. This is the child of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. He's a teenager, not that they would have called them that then, but he's somebody who is bucking at the rules all the time. He's a powerful personality, and everyone seems to think he's a nobody. And I think if he was a nobody, we wouldn't be talking about this at all. If he was a nobody, Richard would have steamrolled over him and said, "Well, I can rule through this young guy. He's no trouble at all." The problem was Edward V wasn't a walkover. He wasn't somebody you could just push around. That's the problem for Richard. And I think he begins to be aware of that. Remember, he hasn't seen much of his nephew over the years. He's been largely in the north, whereas his nephew's been in Ludlow. So they only sort of meet at sort of state occasions, I guess, and those sort of things. But so the problem for Richard is, having arrested Rivers and so on, he then goes to meet the new king. And instead of the new king being a very docile individual, the new king says, "What the heck's going on? What are you doing?" "Oh, Rivers was a traitor." "No, he wasn't." Sort of, I think Richard became aware pretty soon that if he intended to control young Edward, he was going to have his work cut out.
Doesn't in that meeting, doesn't Edward confront both Richard and Buckingham? And Buckingham in particular gets annoyed because Edward won't do what they're telling him to do. Yeah. Or at least he insists on going, "Well, why? Why have I got to do that?" And Richard sort of keeps his composure just about, but Buckingham is going crazy and going, "Why won't this kid just comply?"
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Okay, so Edward then is clearly sort of, this little rich kid who's been now the king and knows it, basically.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. All right, well then, as you say, Richard then realises this isn't going to be as easy as he thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned earlier, does Richard come down planning to take the throne? I don't think that's the case. I don't think Richard is that sort of planner. I think Richard tends to react rather than be proactive. That's just my view. But I think from the moment he arrests Rivers, essentially for me, it's a slippery slope that will ultimately lead to the end of the princes. I can't see how you can arrest Rivers, who is, remember, the person in the nobility that the young Edward V knows best and has relied on for years. Now, he's just been arrested by your Uncle Richard. That is not going to be something that's going to be swept over very easily, I wouldn't have thought.
Okay, so dear sweet Uncle Richard now takes Edward and Richard, Duke of York, under his wing, as it were, and places them in the Tower of London.
Well, Richard Duke of York is still in sanctuary. He's in sanctuary with his mother, Elizabeth Woodville. So he's not actually with his elder brother at this point, which is a little bit of a problem for Richard, actually. But I think we need to talk about why Richard is doing this. And I don't think it's because he wants to be the most powerful man in England. I think it is very much a defensive thing. We talked about the possibility of a Woodville plot a few minutes ago. There wasn't a Woodville plot. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest there ever was. But if you look at it from Richard's point of view, he holds massive lands in the north, but not all those lands are his. Some of those lands are temporarily his. He has the lands of John Neville, the brother of Warwick, for his lifetime, because John Neville's son George was disinherited after the Battle of Barnet and so on. So Richard is holding a lot of his power base is on lands that are only temporarily his, and are only his because his brother Edward says you can have those. His brother Edward's not there anymore. New game, new king. What if the new king says, no, I don't think you should have those anymore. They should go to other Neville relatives, which is, by the way, what should happen if George Neville, remember, who was disinherited, if he dies without an heir, then the law says those lands go to the next nearest male Neville relative. And there are quite a lot of those. So perish the thought that George Neville should die. Oh dear, 4th of May, George Neville dies. So round about all of this is happening, suddenly Richard's position is undermined, because all he needs now to be in trouble is for a Woodville-dominated council and Edward V at its head to rule that he shouldn't have those lands, and they will cut his influence considerably. So I think it's defensive. That's what I would say. Richard is acting defensively, but in what's the word? A very rigorous defense, shall we say?
Yeah, defensive in an offensive way. Yes.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right. That sounds interesting to me, because I know we're in danger of, I think, getting bogged down in this sort of transition. Is it important that we talk about the mechanics of how he acquires Edward V's brother and then sticks them in the Tower? Or should we just say that they end up in the Tower?
Let's remember that the Tower is a royal palace.
Yes, we all assume it's a dungeon.
Yeah, it's not a dungeon.
it's not a dungeon, but it had been used as a prison.
Yeah,
plenty of men had been in prison there.
Yes.
Not in terrible conditions, but
house arrest. I guess.
It's a nice, secure, very comfortable, secure place. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're there, and I mean, up till now, you're both giving the benefit of the doubt to Richard. I would say that he wasn't necessarily intending to claim the throne, but presumably once the two brothers are in his custody, this is where the thought will have crossed his mind.
Well, it's about motivation, is it? Why do the two brothers have to be in his custody? Why is it not okay for one of them to be in sanctuary? And
the way he prized the younger brother out of sanctuary, basically surrounded where they were with soldiers, and forced Elizabeth to give him up. It's pretty hard nosed. Richard's determined to have these the two princes in his custody and nobody else's. And as Derek says, why is that necessary?
Okay, so this is where he's now thinking.
I don't know.
Aside from anything, go on.
Sorry. All I was going to say is I find Richard a tough read, at least up till this point. I find him very, once you clear away all the partisan arguments, anti or pro Richard, I find him quite difficult to understand.
Is he quite a complex man then?
I think so. I think he's quite complex.
I think he was like his father, Richard, Duke of York, whose capacity for self-delusion was boundless. And York convinced himself that he ought to be king, and in the end, despite the fact nobody else thought that, he put himself forward for the throne in 1460. But Gloucester, he has shown throughout the 70s and 80s earlier on that where his rights are concerned, his property rights, his legal rights, he will force things through. He will bend the law until it breaks to ensure that his rights are protected. And if you apply that to this situation where he is clearly at risk, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that he is under threat, let's say, of not being killed necessarily or anything like that, but of losing some of his power, at least. And he doesn't want to do that.
No. I find you mentioned what Richard did in defence of his rights prior to 1483, and he did get up to some very dubious things, like the way he went after Elizabeth Howard and the Countess of Warwick, and so forth. I think with the princes, it's like plenty of noblemen behaved in that way to defend their rights.
Yeah.
But if he took the step of disposing of, like, basically killing his nephews, that's beyond the pale, even for the time.
Is it?
You know, I think so. I mean, these adult aristocrats killed each other on the battlefield or in the courtroom, but two minors who were his nephews, and one of them was the King of England. I think that's, even for the time, that's too much. And it's something that Richard couldn't, whether or not he did it, the point is he couldn't dispel the notion that he had. And that was just a problem he couldn't get rid of, because he couldn't produce the princes after a certain date. And why couldn't he? Where had they gone? You know, are we really to believe that they were spirited abroad to some exotic location? You know,
not on this podcast, David.
But if we look at just one thing about the princes, is it's heresy to say it, but they're kind of irrelevant, really, because that's the next problem. The princes, first of all, Edward's coronation is moved and a new date is set. Now, why does that happen?
Yeah.
Well, because Richard's clearly having dates, and that's in May. So having doubts, sorry, and that's in May. So there's clearly in Richard's head, there is this complex that he is under threat, and things that bear that out, notably the abrupt and brutal execution of Lord Hastings on the 13th of June, when, you know, why would you execute the person who actually warned you and told you to get down there quickly? You would only do it if that person was likely to be a problem. And I can see no other reason for Hastings to be a problem than that Richard was sounding him out, or having somebody like Catesby sound him out on the subject of, well, what if I became king and, you know, the princes didn't, sort of, how would that play?
I think the killing of Hastings in particular, and the way it was done, that it's very impossible to kind of defend in a sort of, if you're going to defend Richard from a moral standpoint. I remember one sort of pro Richard or Ricardian commentator coming out and saying, whatever Hastings did, he was guilty. That's the justification. Richard killed him. Richard's a good guy. Ergo, Hastings is a bad guy. That's the reasoning.
It's tragic,
you know?
Really, isn't it? It's tragic.
But is there not a way of looking at Richard as, you know, a product of his time, and you know, it's neither good nor bad. It's a necessity for him. And I'm interested, so you say that the fact that they're minors makes this beyond the pale. So really, there is no historical precedent of a.
Well, I jumped ahead a bit there because, as Derek said, before you get to the princes disappearing, you have the killing of Hastings, and then all the.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, Richard was a product of his time, and up until this point, I think he had been nothing more or less than that. But yeah, people were clearly disturbed by his behaviour. I mean, when he killed Hastings, actually had him dragged out of the council chamber, Lord Stanley, of all people, who was pretty ruthless himself, he actually stands up and starts shouting what on earth is going on, and he gets beat. Richard's henchmen duff him up.
He gets arrested.
They beat him up first and then drag him off to
Yeah.
to prison just because he stood up and go, what's this? You're going to
And
kill a
what
guy.
becomes of him?
Well, he's eventually let out on sort of strict guarantees, but they rough him up first.
Yeah.
And this is real, there's not even a veneer of legality other
We've
than.
been saying this throughout this series that it's basically The Sopranos.
Yeah, but I mean, up until this point, everyone's pretending that it's not The Sopranos, and now the masks come off, and we're just,
See, the problem is that and all of us are wrestling with this problem, is that if you'd said to somebody on April the 8th or even the 9th, 1483, that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was going to take the throne, disinherit his nephews, there's not anybody in the country who would have believed you. It was just ridiculous. It was a ridiculous idea because Richard had been so famously loyal to his brother, but not only that, Richard had been pretty even-handed in how he dealt with most other people. As we've said, where his own particular rights were concerned, he came heavy-handed. But other than that, generally, he had a very good reputation for being a just ruler of the North, and he got on well with most people. So it was a shock that suddenly we're talking about this guy taking over. And I do feel personally that he never intends to do that, but it's back of an envelope planning. And from the moment he arrests Rivers, for me, as I said earlier, it's inevitable where he goes, unless he's just going to go and commit Harry Carey or whatever. He's committed, and he gets more and more committed with every act. So that in the end, although we're talking about him getting rid of his nephews, and that's terrible and all the rest of it, with the caveat that he might not have done, but basically all of that stems from that initial decision not to work with Rivers, but instead to arrest him. And I think it's a slippery slope, and he just sort of tries to get himself out of each hole as it arises, and in doing so, just gets deeper and deeper into crime, really, and as you say, gangster politics.
So from that, that interpretation, you would sort of frame Richard as not so much a villain as a bungler. I mean, he's handling this all quite badly and just getting himself into one hole after another.
Well, it's difficult to categorise him as a bungler when his best buddy is the Duke of Buckingham, who makes bungling a kind of sort of life experience, really.
Chuckle Brothers.
Well, I mean, I just think, as I said, I just think it's self-delusion. I think he's, in my book, I've got this, if you were going to make a list, what do I do? Get some more men from the north, get rid of so-and-so, and so on. It's like he's got a back of an envelope list and he's just ticking things off and saying to himself, well, what do I do next? What's next on the agenda? And so as ridiculous as it seems, I do feel that he was a man who got himself into a situation which there was really only one end way out, and which is what he did. And he did things to justify, what he eventually did.
So I suppose, and I find that quite convincing actually, but I suppose then the implication that Elizabeth Woodville had been unfaithful is an inevitable consequence of your onward move to ultimately crowning yourself.
Yeah, I mean the whole business of was Edward married or contracted to marry before he married Elizabeth Woodville, and all the rest of that, and all that follows from that, again, is another massive red herring. It doesn't actually matter in law, because all that was necessary, Richard could have said, look, I've uncovered this, it's very bad, but I'm going to pass it on to the church courts to make a ruling, and then Parliament. And if everybody basically said he's king, then he's king. That's all it requires. There's no sort of argument about it. This whole business of, oh, he was illegitimate, so he couldn't be king, is just nonsense. It just didn't happen that way. That's not how the church law worked. So yeah, I mean, therefore for me, it's an excuse. It's just a ruse to justify what he's done or what he intends
all
to
that's
do.
about this. What is it? The Stillington pre-contract and all that sort of thing. It just looks to me like a fairly obvious stitch up to just try and give Richard a bit more traction, another argument to justify what he's doing.
Well, the classic, of course, is that before he tries that argument, he claims that Edward was illegitimate. In other words, calls into question his own mother's moral fibre, shall we say.
Yeah, because
and she was still living, so I don't think she was terribly happy about that.
So I mean, at this point, you talk about Richard and his record of loyalty. He is now blackening his brother's reputation, his nephews, his mother. This has all been blown away.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're right, which I think you probably are, about that he's acting on the defensive, he must have felt pretty desperate to be doing all of this. He's throwing aside his own values, his own sort of previous record, just to what, stay alive.
'Tis the season for all your holiday favorites, like A Very Jonas Christmas Movie and Home Alone on Disney+.
Did I burn down the joint? I don't think so.
Then Hulu has National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation.
We're all in for a very big Christmas treat.
All of these and more streaming this holiday season. And right now, save big with our special Black Friday offer. Bundle Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 1 year. Savings compared to current regular monthly price. Ends 12/1. Offer for ad-supported Disney Plus Hulu bundle only. Then $12.99 a month or then current regular monthly price. 18 plus terms apply.
But this happens with people, doesn't it? They get themselves into a situation and suddenly they can't see another way out except to get themselves deeper. I mean, he happens to be a powerful nobleman, but it happens to lots of people through history and in modern times, that they can't see another way out of it. And I think, personally, I think that's what happened. So it doesn't make it any better, but
no. But this increasing desperation then would suggest he's either, I mean, he crowns himself 6th of July.
Yeah.
And I think Edward V was due to be crowned 22nd of June.
That was the second date.
The second
coronation, the
shifted.
Postponed one. Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if as is likely that he had done away the two brothers, is it likely that between the 22nd of June and the 6th of July they were removed from the game?
I mean, there are loads of theories about this. The bottom line is we haven't the remotest idea.
Okay.
At some point between the end of June and the early September, they disappeared. We don't actually know for certain. There was allegedly a sighting of them in August, but it's not really corroborated very well. So in my book, there was a bit of a clue when he sent their servants away and replaced them with people he'd nominated, which was in July, I think, if I remember right. It might have been earlier. But the one thing is, people of the time didn't know either what was going on with them. It's not that we don't know. They didn't know either. I mean, there was an attempt to rescue them, I think, at the end of July. But the people aiming to rescue them, to be honest, didn't know for certain that they were still alive in any case. So people were acting on what they thought might be the case. And we can come to that later if you like, because that is quite important as time goes on. But yeah, I think they may have been dead by then, but, to be fair, we have no evidence. For all we know, they were spirited away abroad, but I don't believe that personally, but you can't deny that it's a possibility.
Oliver, it just occurred to me, you asked a few minutes ago, were there any precedents for killing minors? And I can think of two offhand, and on both occasions, one was a Scottish princess, and the other two were a pair of German princes who were similar age to Edward and Richard, similar status in the late 13th century. They were all done away with, and we know they were definitely killed because it was done in public. The two princes were executed in a market square, and the Scottish girl, she had her brain smashed out against a stone cross in front of a crowd. The King of Scots just said, kill her, and they brained her. So there's precedents, certainly, but those were done in public. And, you know, part of the problem and the mystery of the princes in the tower is that they just vanish. And whatever Richard did with them, he didn't make it public. He may have had perfectly good reasons for doing so, but it did his reputation at the time and his image, I think, no good at all. There's plenty of evidence that people thought he killed them, especially in London. And I think the French Chancellor actually said before the Parliament in Paris, Richard has killed his nephews. And that happens in 1484, halfway through Richard's reign. So this is doing nothing for him, and he can't get rid of the rumours.
Yeah, I mean, as I sort of vaguely mentioned earlier, it's what people believed at the time that matters, not what actually was, because you act on what you think is the case. And I don't think there's any doubt at all that by the autumn, the vast majority of people were certain that they were dead. And the reason is, why would Elizabeth Woodville support Henry Tudor as king, as a potential king, if she knew or suspected that her two sons were still alive? I just think it's an impossibility. There's no way she would have done that, and yet she does. So it seems to me that everybody, whether they're at the centre or in the provinces, in the counties, seemed to think that the princes were dead. Nobody talks about the possibility of rescuing them again later on.
No. And these rumours are going abroad, so not just to France. I think it's mentioned in front of Ferdinand and Isabella in Castile. You know, it's really poisoning Richard's reputation at home and abroad. And I think at one point, some of Edward IV's old knights actually confront him and say, where are the princes? Show them to us. And once we've seen them, that'll be fine and we'll support you. But he cannot produce them. You know, it just seems obvious what's happened.
Yeah, it's pretty convincing. Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.